Got
Awesome.
it. Super. Yeah. So
Um,
usually, I when I do these book clubs, like I'm happy to just like do sort of like hot seat questions if you all just want to pepper me with questions, and then we can go from there. Yeah.
um, I have some written out, I guess, if that's cool with everyone. Um, but the first question that I have is what books that aren't mentioned in Saigon were monumental to your coming of age? What books do you recommend for someone in their early 20s as that age range isn't really discussed too much in your
Yeah. Can you? I just want to repeat it because so what books were left out? And then what books would I recommend to someone in their 20s?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so there was a chapter that was actually cut out of Saigon because it was too long. That was uh, Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. I loved that play. I love it still. And then, when I made a list of sort of like my desert island books, there were sort of like compendia, like, sort of like collected poems of, like collected poems of Robert Frost, or collected poems of Emily Dickinson, and like those books I think didn't lend themselves as well to sort of being lens books, just because like the range or the breadth of subject matters in like a collected poems is just so wide ranging. So those are the sort of big ones that I like, Shakespeare, and then sort of like poetry collections that I just didn't include. But I sort of tried to put in as many sort of Easter eggs as I could to poems that I really loved in the book anyway. Like I also, just as like a side thing, like in like the original draft of the book, like I had lots of like song lyrics, like to songs, and like I had to take all those out because like apparently you have to like pay licensing fees for the lyrics, and my publisher was like, no, we don't like you that much to like spend the money to pay for the licensing stuff. So I was like, all right, I get it. I snuck a couple of lyrics in there anyway because I just figured like they wouldn't know. So there are some like low key like song lyrics to random songs in there, and I was like, well, I guess somebody's either going to sue me or whatever. But and then as far as like books, gosh, books, I don't know if I have like books specifically for like a 20-year-old person. I mean, I love. I mean, my like sort of desert island, top five books of all time changes. You know, I I've read Viktor Frankl's book Man's Search for Meaning. I probably read that like every 3 years, and I don't necessarily read it cover to cover, but there's like just so much wisdom in that, and it's like darkly funny. And it's like about his time in a concentration camp, and then leaving it, and then trying to sort of like figure out what to do with his life. I mean, it's just like a really powerful book. I mean, he's just an incredible thinker, Viktor Frankl. And then as far as like fiction, I think like I'll mention also, like I think Tara Westover's memoir Educated is like incredible. Like for me, like I think that's like the gold star of like memoirs. Like I mean, it's like a total mic drop. Like I think she doesn't ever have to write a book ever again. Like that book is so good. Uh I love Michael Chabon's Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay that won the Pulitzer 20 years ago, maybe 15. I can't remember, but that book's just incredible. And then this summer, when I was doing some research reading for my novel, like sometimes I'll just go back and reread books that I really love. And I reread this summer Kevin Wilson's Nothing to See Here. And it's so good. Like that book is so good. Nothing to See Here, that like I would read like 3 pages and just like throw it down and just like like it's so good. Like you read every page and you're just like, man, I wish I wrote that sentence. Or like, man, I wish I wrote that. It's incredibly good and really funny and quirky. And yeah, so those are 4 books I think that I think, I mean, I think y'all would love them, I think. Yeah.
Is it all right if I just go right to the next question? Okay. So we've been discussing your writing style and your tone a lot. So we're kind of curious about your writing process and what that was like, especially for a memoir. like of this style, like what that whole experience was like for you and more about your writing process.
Yeah. I mean, I think when I worked, I'm on hiatus from teaching high school right now, but when I just in 2019, I sort of took a break just to write more and just free up a little bit more bandwidth to do other things. But when I was working in high schools, I sometimes would work in the college admissions office. We're helping seniors write their college essays, and I always said to them, the best college essay that you could write is the one that only you could have written. Um, and so I think I really applied that to myself as well when I was working on the book. I thought, I mean, I think there are so many sort of like factors and sort of ways to measure success or talk about success and the success of a book. And I think, much of that can be ego driven or, um, and I didn't want to fall into that trap of like, oh, I really hope I get a good, like Goodreads gives me a good rating or whatever, like that's really, I mean, Goodreads it is helpful. Some folks call it the Yelp of books, which is like it's democracy in all of its, best and worst ways. But anyway, so I think like when I was working on my memoir, I thought, for me, like the most successful book for me would be the one that only I could have written. And so that meant, that meant sort of like this style or the style of writing where it's like very sort of like the tones are very sort of, it's like a mashup of like highbrow and lowbrow. And like I'm making like allusions to like classical literature, but like also I swear a lot. And I don't know. I mean, it's just sort of like who I am. And I think as much as I could present that complexity to the reader through my writing, I wanted to do that. Like I didn't want to sort of like flatten my personality or flatten who I was just for the sake of, having it be readable. Because I actually thought that it might be, fun or interesting for someone to read in a way that I thought I would want to write.
Mhm.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, we all like really enjoyed it.
Oh, thanks.
But we loved like your tone, especially with the like highbrow and lowbrow thing. Um, we were all talking about how like we've had to read a lot of the books that you've discussed in class before, like in high school and things like that. Um, and we were like, you couldn't pay me, like Doug was saying, you couldn't pay me
to read Catch 22. I tried to read it. I couldn't read it. I asked my mom, she was like, I couldn't finish that book. I asked my grandma, she was like, I couldn't finish that book. I was like, maybe it's just a book that's not supposed to be read. But now that you said it, now that you even mentioned it, I have to go back and actually give it its chance.
And I think it's okay. I mean, I think it's those are just the books that I love, but like I think it's okay for like, I think like the there's like sort of like two things that I love most. Like one is like sort of like nerding out with somebody else about their favorite book, and it's like also my favorite book, so it's like I meet someone who also loves like Kevin Wilson's Nothing to See Here. It's like a total geek fest. I also really love it when I meet people and they hate the book that I love, which is like my own personal book club. Like we never ever agree on a book, and I think it's really fascinating and really fun. But I think yeah, I mean, I think I met some, I did a talk, and some folks were just like, they were just sort of like going off and like, oh man, I like really did not enjoy, this book when I was in high school. And I was like, for sure. Like I think it's okay. Like there's not an expectation for anyone to come to my book, having loved or had the same relationships with those books at all. I mean, I hope that people, if they made their own lists, would have sort of like books that moved and were moving to them. But and also, I think sometimes you just read books and you read them at the wrong time. Like you're young or you don't have enough life experience. Excuse me, I'm going to cough. And, yeah. I mean, I try. It's like every couple of years I try to read James Joyce, and I'm just like, ugh, like no, like I just it's just not for me. And I know people have built many careers and PhDs and all sorts of things off the back of James Joyce's work, but it's just not for me. But that's okay. Yeah.
Okay, so our next question is about your family's response to the book, which we were discussing beforehand, and we know you've discussed it in interviews. But we were just kind of curious about the impact that it had on them, if it did have an impact, because it was such a personal.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't I don't know. Yeah, it's funny. No one's ever asked me what the impact of the book was on my family. I would say it's negligible. My parents, my mom is sort of like functionally illiterate, so I don't know if she's read it. I think like my dad, who is a very good reader, probably read it and probably like just sort of like gave her the highlights of the book, as it were. My dad is not a big fan of the book. I'll tell you sort of like two funny stories. Like one, he like maybe like 6 or 7 months after the book came out, like they hadn't said anything to me about it. And so like on a family text thread, I was like, hey, just by the way, I'm curious, like, did you read the book? Like you don't have to, it's a free country, but I'm just curious if you read it. And so my dad just texted back. He was like, yes, I read it. It was very painful. I was like, okay. And then that was sort of all we said. That was in 2020. And then just this past April, I saw my parents for the first time during the pandemic in 3 years. I just hadn't seen them, because of, COVID. And we were sitting around and someone asked my dad, in front of all of us what he thought of my book. And my dad said, I didn't like it, but it's Phuc's story to tell, which I thought was like incredible for my dad to say. I mean, y'all read the book. Like it's, I think it was really amazing for him to say that and to sort of acknowledge that, it was hard for him to read and he didn't like the book, but, it's, it sort of is what it is. He, this is just a side story. So before he read the book, he ordered 100 copies of the book to give out to all of his friends. And then he read the book and then he didn't give out any copies. So in his garage, he's got like 100 copies of my book that like he will never, ever, ever give to anybody.
We have one last like preset question, and it's related to our last book of the month, which was The Undocumented Americans, and that also deals with themes of immigration. That deals with undocumented immigration, and that's also like often considered punk. So we were wondering what other books about immigration topics related to it you recommend, and then if you know of any other books that have like a similar kind of punk ideology as The Undocumented.
That's a good. I haven't read the undocumented Americans. You said undocumented Americans.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds interesting. I'd love to read that. And is that nonfiction as well?
Yes. Yeah.
There's a book called High Desert that just came out. It's like a graphic novel memoir by the guy that founded Afropunk in New York. And it's a graphic novel, but it's definitely like sort of kind of in the same space as mine. He talks about growing up as like a Black kid in California, and being in the punk scene, in which at the time in the 80s, there's not a lot of Black kids in the punk scene, and sort of like trying to find his way through the world. I think that book's really excellent. I mean, again, graphic novel, so there's like a different sort of like vibe to it, but and I think just the experience of, being in a space where, I think the conversation is just different when you are in the punk space and you're sort of navigating the Black-white sort of like dichotomy of like sort of American racism. I think it's just different. I think that's a great book. There's also another book called Boys and the Void, Boys, BOYZ, the letter N, and then in the void. And that's also about like a young sort of punk, a Black punk rock kid sort of navigating and figuring out sort of like where he fits into the punk scene, vis-a-vis, when the punk scene is sort of predominantly like just sort of like angry white kids, like where does Black rage, right, fit into the punk scene? I think it's such a fascinating conversation. I mean, there's tons of just like also just like kind of like punk rock books. I mean, like Henry Rollins, has written endlessly about his own sort of like travels in the punk scene. But I don't. I'm trying to think if I don't know if I've read a ton. Like honestly, I didn't seek out or am widely read in like sort of like the punk memoirs thing before I wrote my book. Like I just wrote it because it was sort of just my lived experience, but it wasn't like an experience that I was also looking to read about, if that makes any sense. Honestly, like I think when I read, I want to read about experiences that I haven't lived. So even before I wrote my book, like after I wrote it, I felt like, oh, I should probably read like other Vietnamese writers, but but prior to my book, like I hadn't read a ton of like Vietnamese authors because I just was like, I lived like I have lived the Vietnamese experience. I don't think I need to read a book about it. Like I would much rather read like a book about like Tara Westover's book, or a book about like undocumented Americans, or like books that sort of give me an entree into another perspective or another experience. Like that's so much more interesting to me. And that is not to say that I haven't sort of learned or been enriched by reading, other Vietnamese writers. It just wasn't the thing that I thought like, oh, I should read. But, obviously I'm wrong. We should just read as much as possible. But yeah.
That's kind of the end of our like preset questions. So if anyone has anything else they'd like to bring up.
I wanted to ask you, what was your experience in college like, and how did it differ from your expectations, like leaving high school going into it?
Can you say that last part? I got up to the very last phrase there. I think I lost that.
So like, how did your experience in college differ from what you expected to be leaving high school?
Oh gosh, yeah. It was I mean, there was just no way that college was going to live up to what I wanted it to be. Like I really like I went off to college thinking I don't know. I was like a 17-year-old kid. And I was just like I just like at that point, and I just thought that like everything shitty about like my town was like specific to my town. And I was like, if I just leave Carlisle, like everything will be great. And so like I went off to Bard, and it was just like too. I had freighted that experience beforehand with like just too much. And I was so disappointed, mostly by my like fellow classmates, like I think like meeting kids who were freshmen in college, and like they were like skipping class and like getting wasted on like a Wednesday night, and I was just like, aren't you guys here to like go to class and read books and like learn? Like, why are you skipping class? This is insane. Like, this is what you're paying money for. It was just like, like I just was, I mean, obviously, like that's what, that is also part of the college experience. But, having just done that all in high school already, like I really was like, okay, like I'm not here to like get shit faced and skip classes. Like I'm here to like learn. And I think like when I didn't find immediately, like a like-minded cohort, like it was really hard for me to realize. It was like a big letdown that college was not like this sort of this like Shangri-La of like higher education or whatever, that it was just it's gonna be what you make of it, I guess. So it was a hard time for sure, but in a different way. It was like kind of self-inflicted, in some ways, like.
So kind of going off of that, what advice do you kind of wish you could have given your college self to kind of like, I guess kind of navigate college as someone who was there to kind of learn and had kind of those high expectations for it?
Yeah, totally. I mean, gosh, if I could write like a letter to like 17-year-old Phuc, like I would just be like, well, be curious, and don't get so hung up on this idea of like what should be, like, and or expectations, like, there's like some joke, right? Like expectations is just sort of like future resentment. Like I think so, yeah. Like I think I was just so sort of dogmatic about what I thought I wanted to do and what college was supposed to be for me. To the extent that I was really inflexible for a good chunk of that, and it was just time wasted. In retrospect, if I had just been open to the experience and been like, okay, I guess like this is just going to be what it's going to be, I think I just would have had a better time, and it would have been a richer experience.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, if you could speak up just a little bit, or yeah, or come towards the computer.
I'll go right there.
Awesome.
So I see you're on a teal couch. I love interior design. What way are there any ways that you've brought like punk into like the way you create your space?
Oh gosh. I mean, I don't that yeah, I mean in the sense that like I don't really worry about what other people think, you know? Like I think like at the end of the day, like for me, as a middle-aged guy, like who I don't think like I don't walk around being like I'm punk rock, but I think but I think I've got a pretty healthy sort of disdain for what other people think, and like I'm not looking for like external validation, and like at the end of the day, like I think that's like the sort of like the truest sort of takeaway for punk, right, is sort of I think like very similar to the write-up that you all did, right? It's just sort of like being true to yourself and doing doing what you want to do. I mean, obviously, as long as it's not harmful to other people, but like not worrying about like this approval or external validation. So I don't know if I have like a my taste in terms of interior design is like pretty eclectic, but also kind of old. I sort of let this is like I sort of let like the house or the space kind of dictate that, if that makes sense. So like like we live in like an old like sort of it's called like a Phuc Victorian. It's like a house in Maine, but it's like built in 1906, so it just has like an old timey vibe. So we have like an old timey couch. I'm not like I don't want to sort of cram this full of like sort of sleek mid-century modern furniture when like the house doesn't really and the bones of the house don't really call for that. So I think, yeah, I don't know.
No skulls.
Please.
I had a question. So one of the things I was really like interested about while I was reading your book, was your mother and like her characterization, just because I feel like we definitely do get a lot from your dad, and at times it did like feel like it was hard to like piece your mother's like experience together. And I did notice that you mentioned earlier that I forgot like what phrase you used, but like bordering like literate.
Mhm.
And I really liked how throughout the book, whenever like your mom spoke or someone spoke in Vietnamese, you wrote like Vietnamese. And I thought it was like very interesting, like your characterization of like language and like how that fit in your story. And I noticed that that wasn't something like you spoke about like very explicitly. And obviously it's harder to like integrate Vietnamese like words into your text, even though like I know you did it with like asking about like what side of like the water are you from, and that going into more explanations about that. But what was like your relationship to like language, and what like made you choose like Vietnamese and talking about like your mother like Vietnamesing? And yeah, sorry, kind of a jumble, but
Oh, it's okay. Yeah. I mean, I chose like I sort of came up with the way to say that really just as a like it sort of felt more efficient to me. I actually stole that from German. So in German, it was like my minor in college, and like I studied abroad, but in German, sometimes they'll skip the "can you speak" and they'll just say "kannst du Deutsch," like "can you German," and that's like shorthand for "can you speak German?" And I always thought that was like really efficient because it's German. Germans are so efficient. So I sort of just stole that and was like, oh, like I think I'm just gonna sort of do that. Also, like in English, like I just felt I wrote when I was writing it, like I wrote a couple of times where I was like, and she said in Vietnamese, and it just felt clunky. And then I just dawned on me. I was like, oh, why don't I just say and she Vietnamese, blah blah blah. And it was like kind of funny, and then but also really efficient. So so it just felt like that was like deeply appealing to me if it's like something is funny and efficient. Um, and I think my relationship with language is like really, it's so tricky. Like, I think, at this point, especially with my parents, like we sort of speak like this hybrid, like English, Vietnamese, sort of like patois or like pidgin all the time. And that's true for like, I think many like immigrant families, and like one first and like 1.5 generation. Um, like my parents will forget words in Vietnamese, and so they'll just like plop English into the middle of like a Vietnamese sentence, or like sometimes their sentences are like 30% English. It's like if you grew up or lived in like New York or an urban area, like you'll hear like Spanglish. It's sort of like half Spanish, half English, and that's definitely true with us as well. And I think that's true for many immigrant families. Yeah, so I think, but my Vietnamese is like not great. It probably like tops out at like a second grade level, just because like my parents didn't, they like Vietnamese school, like the idea of like going to a place on the weekend to learn to read or write Vietnamese just didn't exist, where we lived. And my parents really, very intentionally sort of created this hierarchy of English and then Vietnamese, because like they recognized that like all of their impediments, and all of their obstacles, as they saw it in the US, like hung on or were created or came from their lack of sort of the command of the English language. And so I think like my parents, especially in terms of raising me and my brother, they were like, you guys need to learn English, and you need to learn English so well that like if you're in another room and we hear you talking, you're just going to sound like a bunch of American kids. And we were like, okay, and then at some point they're like, well, your Vietnamese really sucks. And I'm like, yeah, like what do you want? Like, like, so yeah, it's, so I don't know if I answered your question or not, but
Oh yeah, thank you.
yeah, sure. Thanks.
Question. Can you hear me?
Mhm.
I was just curious about when you decided or started the process of writing your memoir, and I have a follow-up question depending on your answer.
Well, so when did I start? So your question is, when did I decide to write the memoir? Yeah, so it's a little bit of a long answer, but I'll try and sort of be as quick as possible. So like in 2012, I gave a TEDx talk. And then after that happened, I started doing like live storytelling in and around Portland, sort of like in the style like of like the Moth Radio Hour, where you just like get up on stage and like tell a true story from your life. So I did that for about like 4 years. Like I would do that like once or twice a year. Like I would sign up to do a live storytelling event. And for that, you have to like write a 7-minute story, a true story from your life, and then memorize it and then get up on stage and perform it. And so after about like 4 years of doing that, like I thought, oh, like, like every time I did it, like I would just get like sort of this great feedback from people. And so like I think like right around then, like 2015 or 2016, like I thought, yeah, after doing the live storytelling for about 4 years, I thought like, oh, like maybe someday, like when I'm like retired and I'm like 70 and don't have anything to do, I'll write a book maybe or something, or just like write like some vignettes. And then in 2016, a literary agent actually approached me. She like cold called me via email, like just sent me an email, and then asked me if I was interested in writing a memoir, because she had seen the TEDx talk and was, thought that I had an interesting story to tell. So that's really, like, I was sort of thinking about writing a book, and then I was approached by an agent, and so she sort of like put the fire under me to write a book and not wait till I was 70.
Yeah. My follow-up question, I can't remember, but I know you have daughters, and I was wondering, did that affect, or like did being a parent affect the way that you reflect on your own childhood and like in your writing? I don't know when your children were born, but I figure it was around that time or something.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I think they were 6 and 9 at the time when I was writing the book. And yeah, I mean, for sure. Like I think the biggest takeaway for me was, sort of just thinking about um all of the ways in which I needed my parents to be there for me, and the ways in which they weren't able to be. And I don't say that as like an indictment, or, like I'm not like sort of like bringing up old shit, or, but it was just interesting to me to think about like, to think about like growing up in Carlisle and how hard that experience was, and then to go home, and then to not feel like your family had your back. Like that was really, I think like that really struck me as I was working on the book as like a not, it just wasn't a great experience for me. And I hadn't thought about it before. The other thought that I had just about my own childhood and thinking about my daughters was, you know, like school was like my safe space. Like that was the place that like I felt the safest, like in the classroom, like even in high school, in spite of everything else. Like I definitely did not feel like home was a safe space. And so I think like, if it's, I don't know if it's like a cautionary tale or if it's just sort of like reactive, but I definitely want my kids to feel like, their house is their safe space, and like, that I'm an ally, and that like I'm here to listen to them. Like I'm not here to fix their problems, but I'm certainly here to support them and sort of fledge them into the adults that they're going to be, whoever they are. Yeah.
Thank you. I have two questions. My first one is if you are still in contact with any of your high school friends from your crew, and how like if so, like if they read the book and how they liked it, and like I just think it's a really cool thing, because I think a lot of the times in the moment of friendships you don't express how much things really meant, and I think this book would have been a really cool way to do that. So just my first question.
Yeah, I wasn't like, after college, and then especially like once we entered adulthood, I think a lot of us just fell out of touch, and then I think with social media, in the early 2000s sort of, coming into existence, like a lot of us got back into touch loosely. So that like, we were able to see like, where people lived and who was balding and all that stuff. And then when I started working on the book, I actually went back to Carlisle on some research trips. I don't have any family that lives there anymore. My parents moved away in the late 90s. So I went back to Carlisle a few times for some research trips and met up with my friends then. And that was great. And a lot of them still live there. Like, I think like when I went there, we like six of us like met up and, had beers, and, I wanted to do research and make sure that I was getting the story as right as I could. And I think, so all of the names of my friends are changed, but so I think it was really fun for them to read through the books, but like the descriptions are all the same. So like they would read through the books and like recognize like who was who, and that was pretty funny. And I think it's very funny. Like, so the two brothers, was it Liam and Dylan? Like they they said we did not fight that much, and then I talked to all of my other friends, and they're like, dude, they fought all the time. So I think it's very funny. Like it's very funny how people remember things, in a way, and but then like so you sort of it's a little bit like somehow like if you do like the Wikipedia version or sort of like the group the group think version or the hive mind, like somehow it might be more accurate. And it's also, it was amazing to me to think about like what things people remember and don't remember, like my friend Nate, who like got into the fight at the end of my senior year and like got suspended instead of me. When I went on the research trip, like he went out with me for beers, and I said, hey, do you remember when I was going to get into a fight with that redneck kid and you went and got into the fight for me so that I wouldn't get suspended, because I was going to graduate? And he was like, no, I don't remember. I have no idea. That was like, holy cow, that's so amazing. It was just amazing that like it was so momentous for me, and like just it was just another Tuesday for him.
Okay, my other question was I wanted to know how you decided, or like why you chose to end the book the way in that specific scene with Molly. like why you chose that moment to leave us
Yeah, I mean, I mean, in part because I mean, it happened, it could happen that way, and I definitely wanted to end it on or around graduation as a nod to sort of like 80s teen movies, like many of the 80s sort of teen high school movies, like end like on graduation, it's like this, like, yeah, I graduated. And so I wanted to have a little bit of a callback to that. Um, and it just felt like, so I was just sort of writing and I was like writing the scenes and thinking about like, what happened on graduation night. And we like went to a party and then like we ended up at the diner, which is like where like everybody always ended up. And like, as I was writing that scene, like, it just felt like it was sort of like the metaphors and the imagery was just sort of like all there as I was writing it. And I was just like, all right, I guess this is it. This is where it's going to end, I there was like another draft of the book where I had like an epilogue where I go back for like my 10-year high school reunion, but it felt a little bit like too like a hat on a hat, like it just felt like a little bit too much. And I wanted it to feel a little bit kind of bittersweet, as high school graduations and sort of, the ends and beginnings of things can be. And so I really wanted to capture that sort of complexity as much as I could, but also have it sort of wrapped up in like the idea of like my town and like how complicated my town is. And like, like you really can't make this stuff up. Like I lived in a town where like we had a truck stop diner and it was called the All American Diner. I mean, it was just like really bizarre, so it just felt like in a book where I'm writing about trying to find my place in America and what does it mean to be American. And, it just felt really strangely fitting to end it sitting in the All American Diner.
No, I really, now that you say that, when I was reading it at the end, I was like, oh, this is nice. But it felt like a very like 80s real American, like this is the end of my chapter. Let me move on to greater things. And no, I really felt that and I enjoyed how you ended it.
Oh, thank you. Thanks. Yeah.
I had a couple of quick questions. I was interested in just like your multiple careers in general, like how you got into tattooing specifically, and also I know that you're a Latin teacher, I think I saw. I wanted to know like why you specifically chose Latin, or like what was your process of like figuring out what kind of teacher you wanted to be?
Yeah, my resume is like a train wreck. Let me just tell you. But also like I think it's just like I think I just say yes to a lot of like I think what I was saying before about being so regimented when I started college and not being curious. Like I think now for me, like the pendulum is swung like completely the other way in all of the best ways. Like I think I'm so open to whatever, and I'm just like, sure, I've never done that before. Let's do that. That sounds crazy. Like I never thought I would do that, but you know what? Like I'm down for the adventure. And so like so I ended up studying classical languages and literature at Bard College because I just like just totally by accident, like I ended up taking ancient Greek just totally on a lark because I heard somebody else talking about it. Like some kid said, oh, Greek's like the hardest thing I've ever done, like ever. It's the hardest thing I've ever done. It's the hardest thing anybody could ever do. And I was like, oh, like, that just like caught my ear for whatever reason. So I did that. And it was very, very hard. But I was like totally stoked on it. And the professor was great too. It was like a small department. And so I just ended up taking Greek, and then I did Sanskrit, and then I did Latin, and then I did German. And then all of a sudden I was like, I had too many credits to do anything else. So, and then I went to grad school. I didn't know what else to do, a degree in a bunch of dead languages. So I went to grad school, but I knew that I wanted to teach high school. Like I think I've always known that I wanted to teach high school very much because of all the great teachers that I had in high school as well. Like I just felt, in a very simple way, like I just wanted to pay it forward and do right by them. So I went to a graduate program for specifically, it was like a master's in classical languages and literature, but it also was like 1/3 like education degree. So it like prepared you for teaching high school. And then I was getting tattooed at the time, just like sort of just because that's what I did. It was like sort of an offshoot of just being part of the punk scene in the 80s. So I was getting tattooed in college. And then like a month before the end of grad school, the guy who was tattooing me, he just said, "Hey, like we're looking for an apprentice and you seem like you're really into tattoos, like you should apply." And I was like, "Okay, yeah, sure, yeah, I'll apply, like, what's the worst that could happen?" So I applied to be a tattoo apprentice, and I got it. And so I moved to New York City to learn how to tattoo, and it was unpaid. So the apprenticeship was unpaid. So I taught Latin during the day at like a fancy schmancy private school. And then at like 3 p.m., I would just like leave and then go and work at the tattoo shop until like 10 at night. So yeah, I don't, and then nobody told me to stop doing that like, for whatever reason. And I was just sort of like so excited by like all of it. I was in my 20s. I like, had like so much energy. And so I just like so I just taught Latin during the day and tattooed at night. I did that for like 20, whatever years, 22 years.
I just thought that was interesting too with tattooing because I didn't obviously you talk so much about how much you were into music and literature and which is art in itself, but I just didn't even realize like, oh my God, he obviously can draw amazingly well. Because you're a tattoo artist.
And that was like a big thread also in high school that like my editor and I just decided that we just couldn't add. There was like so much in the book already, but like I was also like a super like art nerd. Like I took like every art class that my high school could offer. And like we ran out of art classes for me to take. And so like my senior year, my art teacher just like cleared out a broom closet and put me in the closet and just was like, just do whatever you want and I'll give you an A. And I was like, okay. And like, yeah, that was pretty great. Yeah.
One more quick question. And I will admit I did Instagram stalk you a little bit. I was interested on how you met your wife.
Sorry, how I met?
How you met your wife.
How I met my wife?
If you want to share, you don't have to.
Oh yeah. I was just repeating because I wasn't sure if that's what you were. Yeah. So my wife and I went to college together. But we didn't date in college. We're both very clear about that. We were just friends in college. And then after college, maybe like 4 years after college, like we met up and then we started dating. I believe people call it a booty call. So we met up after college. There was a booty call that happened, and then we were just like, and then we've been friends for like almost like 9 years, and so we're like, oh shit, like, oh, this is super good. And then I think like once we started dating, like within a year we got married. Like it was, like we kind of knew, and it was, I think we were like 28, I think 28, 27. But yeah.
That's awesome.
So this book is kind of about, your childhood and like your experience growing up with your parents. How would you say that your experience relates to how you act as a parent, and specifically in regard to like, your connection with your Vietnamese culture and how you kind of integrate that into your life now with your daughters?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've done like a fuck ton of therapy in my 30s, and then actually that was precipitated by finding out that my wife was gonna have our first daughter. Because like I knew that as a parent, I didn't want to just do the opposite of what my parents did, because that doesn't seem like thoughtful parenting. That just seems reactionary. And so I just wanted to like work out my shit and whatever, to the best of my ability, just so that I could be present and thoughtful as a parent. So I think, yeah, so I don't, I would not say like, I definitely don't, I'm not just like, oh, I do the opposite of my dad or whatever like that. I think it's just different. And I think it's also like, it's really dictated by what my kids need, right? Like, I think like, it's not like a one size fits all thing, it's just like, who is the parent, or what is the type of parent that my daughters need. And it's not even like they need the same person. So I think as much as I can do, like I want to sort of respond to those needs, and just sort of be present for that. I think it's it's hard for me to say like what how Vietnamese sort of culture is integrated into sort of my day-to-day life. It's like part of me feels like it's so deeply it's like so deeply baked into who I am that I couldn't undo it. But like I know it's there, like obviously there's like the sort of like the food piece and like some of the sort of cultural stuff, like I don't know, like don't wear shoes in the house, right? Or like we celebrate like Lunar New Year and things like that. Um, but I don't, it's almost like I'm too close to it to give you like like you would almost have to ask my wife maybe to see like, what her takes are on what is the sort of like specifically Vietnamese and what's just sort of like my idiosyncrasies. Yeah. It's tough to say, and also like being bicultural, or like growing up in the US too, right? Like in some ways, like I feel like it's like the best of both worlds. Like I can kind of like pick and choose because, it's like American, like there's no culture that's perfect, right? For sure. And having access to sort of like very distinct cultures, like I can kind of, sort of treat it as this like kind of buffet and being like, well, like toxic masculinity, I don't want that, but like I'll take a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and no thanks to the patriarchy and no thanks to racism, and but like, ooh, I love DIY. Ooh, I love like Vietnamese DIY culture, or I don't know. So it's been really great. I feel it's been deeply liberating, as opposed to someone who just sort of grows up in a monoculture. Like there's not a lot of, or there's not as much choice, but when you have like two cultures to choose from, I mean, it's sort of like twice as much shit, but also like, twice as much gold too, I think.
I know you mentioned in the book at times feeling differently about things, kind of reflecting as an adult than you did in the
Could
moment.
you speak up? I'm sorry. Like I'm super like I'm really having a hard time hearing you. Sorry. Thanks.
Yes. I know you mentioned in the book sometimes feeling differently looking back on things as an adult than you did in the moment and being younger. And I'm sure talking about these things publicly or at events before writing the memoir kind of changed this, but was there anything going through the memoir process specifically that changed for you or really resonated with you going through that experience and reflecting on those things in that book?
Yeah, I mean, um I think writing my parents as like real characters. I mean, they're real people, but I think like writing them in a way to convey their humanity was really powerful for me. And it really made me, I, I was, I was empathetic before about what they went through, but I think like writing their stories really, really drove home for me um, how difficult it was for them, and sort of like how stuff that they went through. I mean, it's like your country literally implodes. Like you have no country to go back to, and you leave it with 1.5-year-old kid, and you don't speak the language, and you go to another country. Like that sounds like terrible, right? Like so terrible. And so the fact that they like lived through that and not only like survived it, but like thrived in some fashion, I think is really incredible. Um, and I think it's like this balance, right? For me, like I want to sort of say, I want to talk about that and also talk about all the ways in which they were deficient as my parents, right? And weren't there for me when I needed them to be there. And I think it's a complex picture. And so I really wanted to portray that as much as possible. Like I hope it didn't come across like my parents are just sort of these like, sort of like flat two-dimensional, sort of like monstrous people, because it was definitely not my intention. In the same way that I didn't want to portray my town, like Carlisle, like as like, oh, it's like, this like, sort of racist shithole, like which it's not. It's like it's a complicated place. There's like great people and there's not great people. But that's like America, that's life, that's all of us, right? Like we I think anytime that we can resist that like reductive thinking in our own stories, where we're either the villain, the victim, or the hero, right? Like it's not always so clear cut. Like then sometimes we're all three, or or some mix of that in any given situation. So folks, I have to sign off now. It's 6:30, but there like anyone have like one last burning question that they didn't get to ask that they really, really need to ask?
I was curious, how has your music taste evolved as you've gotten older?
Oh yeah, I totally listen to like old guy, like middle-aged guy music now. I know, I mean, it's just like, I mean, I what I mean, I really love, I mean, I think like I really gravitate towards like indie rock and like indie pop. And I mean like you know, I'm trying to think here, like, you know, like Arlo Parks, like I really love Arlo Parks, like I love Khruangbin. I mean, I'm just kind of like chill, like old guy music, you know, I still go see live music too. Like, um, I think like right before the pandemic, like we went and saw this indie rock band from Ohio, Guided by Voices. We went and saw them in 20,
Yes.
right before the pandemic, so they were great. So I think it's, you know, I mean it's very eclectic. I mean, I'll say this, like, again, going back to that dogmatic thing, like when I went to college I was like, oh, I listen to punk rock, that's all I listen to. And then like at some point, like I met these like punk rock kids from New York City, and they were like, oh, like we listen to hip hop, and like we listen to jazz, and like we listen to like Motown. And I was just like, you're not punk rock. And they're like, dude, punk rock is like you just do what you want to do. And I was like, oh, so it's like, imagine like being like a 20-year-old kid discovering like Motown for the first time, you know, like Marvin Gaye. I mean, like my mind was blown. It was just like Marvin Gaye's like the shit, you know. Like, it was kind of amazing. Like, so I think it's like, what a gift, right? Like for me, like I was like, man, like what a gift to like discover Motown in your 20s, because you were just like such a dumbass that you were just like, I'm punk rock, I don't listen to Motown, you know. And then you hear like Ain't No Mountain High Enough, and you're just like, oh my God, that song is amazing.
Oh, really quick before you go, I just wanted to know, oh, hi, Phuc, I'm Douglas, by the way. But I just wanted to know a little bit more about, I guess, Lou's reactions and like his impact on you after reading the book. Because even some of the things he thought he was just being inquisitive, like how they like changed your like mind and your way of thinking a little bit.
Yeah, no, I love my brother. He's great. And he you know, I think if there was anybody that I was worried about reading the book, it was my brother. And when he read an advanced copy, you know, he was just like, dude, you nailed it. Like you nailed like the two things that I thought would be really difficult to capture, you know, like the dysfunction of our family and also like what it was like growing up in our town. So that was like getting his sort of stamp of approval was really important to me. Or validating. It was really just like, whew, okay, like, you know, just because like our Venn circles of experience overlap so much. And Douglas, I forgot, was there a second part to your question that
Oh
I
no,
didn't?
that was just kind of it, kind of just like his impact, because I know some of the things that he even said, like it kind of, I guess, made you think about like how to like live your high school life and like the way he acted. So I was just wondering his, I guess
Yeah,
his way of
yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, just like I'll just end on this, you know, like I didn't realize, like, you know, we had this like really intense sort of like falling out in our 20s. And we didn't talk for like 3 years, and it was like we had this huge blow up fight. And then like and then in our process of like you know, sort of like reconnecting and like, you know, clearing the air and like, you know, he was like, he's like, you are the father figure to me. And I was like, oh, like, you know, this whole time like I was thinking like I'm just your brother and like I can just like say dumb shit and like, you know, you won't take it personally. But like I didn't realize that in his mind, and I don't think he was able to articulate it until we had this big fight, that like that he really viewed me as like the person who raised him, and that like I'm more paternal to him than fraternal. And that was like a huge sort of big, it was a wake up call for me. And also just like it's just so interesting to think about how relationships and how you are viewed by other people. Like you just don't know, like, and even other people don't know until they have to articulate that, right? It's like that like goofy like bumper sticker, you know. It's like, you know, to the whole world you may just be one person, but to one person you may be the whole world.
Thank you.
Of course. All righty, thanks so much, guys. Yeah, thanks. Tell me about what book you're reading next.
We're gonna be reading Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. Yeah.
Awesome. Great. Enjoy that. Yeah, super. Thanks so much. Good luck with your semester. And yeah, thanks again for picking my book.
Thank you so much.
Ready. Bye.
Bye.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yes.
Like that was such a cool opportunity and we never would have had it. You guys can do that. So thank you. Admin.
Yes, thank you, Admin.
Yeah, does anyone have like final thoughts or things that they were thinking about like while he was here that we didn't get to touch on?
I'm just glad that Douglas threw in that last one about
Yeah,
like I like that was really cool. I didn't even think about it.
Yeah, I know, because we were telling his parents, they were like, damn, his parents did do a lot of crazy stuff, but like low-key, his safe space was like woo. And so I was like, wait a second, even in the acknowledgements, he was like, you low-key were my hero. And so I was like, hold on, did you ever know that you were my hero? Yeah. But
So your question and that question that I realized, like there was just so many questions to ask.
Yeah.
I was like, oh my God, wow.
Yeah. I was like the whole time thinking about like I know briefly in the book he mentioned like the universality of like literature and like I just loved like hearing about the conversations that he was like having with his friends and like random people that he was like meeting and his like teachers and stuff because it felt like so reflective of like my experience like with my own friends and then like here. I also just thought it was like so wonderful that so many, especially like going back to what you said, like he was able to tie in so many like complex themes in like such a short amount of time, but also like there were so many things that like so many people were able to like relate to, and like me and my mom would throughout like reading the book would like call and like talk about it, and like I know she had so many things that like she was able to like really relate to her own experience, and then it was like the same for me, which is like so cool to like have that like yeah.
Your mom share?
Yeah, Mom, do you want to share? Are you comfortable?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So one of the things that I thought was interesting that he said is that he doesn't necessarily read books by other Vietnamese authors because he said that he has already experienced it on his own, which I thought was really, really interesting because some of my favorite parts of the book were like feeling like I get you, I hear you. And I grew up around the same time, so same music. And he talked about cologne that people wore to dances and things like that. It was very, very, I could relate to that whole piece of it too. And I wore my Doc Martens in high school too. Morgan wishes I still had them, but it was just interesting to kind of go through that time. And it was a very, very different time. And you know, where it was harder to grow up Asian in a school where, you know, there wasn't that many of us and stuff. And so growing up also with an Asian parent, I mean, I had a very different experience than his, but also some of the similarities I noticed, and Morgan can appreciate this because my mom is very different to Morgan than she was to me. But when the reporter came in and he was talking to his dad and said, he was saying how proud he was to the reporter, but he wouldn't say it to him, which is very, very similar to my experience with my mom. Is, you know, she would say things to other people about me, but not to me. And there was never "I love you" or affection or things like that. And all of you that know me and know my relationship with Morgan, she can't walk through the room without me telling her I love her. And I want her to know from me how proud I am of her. So my favorite part of the book, which is, I think, whoever's sitting next to Charles, it had said something about the acknowledgement to his daughters and like, you know, that thing. But I think my favorite part of the book was the way that he expressed love to his wife and to his girls, which I think is just his parents really loved him, but they just loved differently, right? And so like I love differently, and it's not like I wanted to do opposite of my parents because I did have a good childhood. It was just very, very different. So I know I love differently to Morgan. So I thought the whole book was just so good and so honest and so funny. And I'm grateful because it wouldn't be a book that I would ever pick up, right? Morgan had me read another book that I really related to, Crying in H Mart, which is very, very much a book for me that like got me in my soul. So anyway, long story short, that's my take is my favorite part was the acknowledgement, just because it just kind of showed who he became, and and it wasn't just about his grades, which that was very much my life, or just being very different. And I think I'm just grateful that you all live a different life right now, and people are all of you are so much kinder to people, and you're making the world a different place than it was when I was younger and he was younger. So that's all.
Thank you, Mom.
I'm not an author, but I love the book.
Two more things. I like off of that, I think for like me, and I know like a lot of the people that I've talked to, like something that he spoke about that like I can relate to now, just like the act of like growing up and like coming of age, and then also like seeking out like fitting in and like seeking out individuality through like reading and like different ideas and stuff. Like I thought that was like so awesome. And then I forgot what else. So never mind.
But going off that, I think a lot of people reading this, like there were parts that I think everyone could relate to, because like you're growing up in a place where you're somewhat different no matter what it is, like race, sexual orientation, whatever. And then now you have to like navigate, especially in high school, you have to like navigate yourself. And it's hard. And you're reading this and you're like, okay, especially reading this now, like we live in the Midwest. We know some of the things that he's talking about, and it's like, oh, this is very relatable. And I think throughout the book, I was reading, and there was this song that came into my head that I put on the hardcover Hotties playlist. And I have to bring it up now because I feel like a lot of people could relate to it, but I should have been ready.
While Douglas searches for the song, we just wanted to reiterate that the book for next month is going to be Burning Seagrass by Robin Kimmer, and I know it's a very like popular book that like maybe some of you have like read before. If you haven't, you have to read it. Like, I don't know how to also say it, but like you have to read this book. It's like the best ever. But we're really excited to like collect the media map and like have like different sources, and maybe even like find other organizations and like ways that we can incorporate like what we're actually reading about and like do something about it so that people aren't obviously like this month like being bullied or like suffering like because of their experience with refugees, or in the case of like next month like indigeneity. So look out for that book, check out Bookspace, check out the stuff that are posting about it, but awesome book.
Yes, I found the song. It's called Outside by Mariah Carey. It's about her being like biracial and growing up biracial, but I think a lot of this just has to go with like being bullied. But she says, it's hard to explain. Inherently, it's always been strange. Neither here nor there, always somewhat out of place everywhere. Ambiguous, without a sense of belonging to touch. Somewhere halfway, feeling there's no one completely the same. Standing alone, eager to just believe it's good enough to be what you really are. But in your heart, uncertainty forever lies, and you'll always be somewhere on the outside. And I thought about that. I feel like, do I get some snaps or something? No, I feel like throughout that whole time, and I think towards the end too, where he's like, okay, like I wanted to be punk because I didn't want to be a nerd anymore. Like I was in middle school, and then like I don't really fit in with my family, and the whole time I was like, okay, he's like on the outside, and I feel like no matter what, in terms of just being bullied in general, because you're being bullied for being like different for something, everyone has had that feeling of being like on the outside. So I think that's why like this was really relatable for a whole bunch of people.
I was just gonna say I wasn't expecting to relate like super heavily because I feel like I'm just now fully entering my punk phase. But that whole thing, like his whole reasoning for wanting to like be a punk and like be into it was like my same reasoning for wanting to be emo in middle school. And I don't know, it was just like so, it felt so validating. Like both the like last month's book and then this month's book, like kind of like leaving space for like that angst like for people of color and like hearing that voice. Because like my anger is always invalidated. And I don't know, it was just like I like can't stop thinking about this book. I'm like, damn. Because like now when I listen to like my little angsty playlist, I'm just like, yep.
Yeah.
This is for me. This is for me.
Yeah.
When he talks about, I forget exactly like what points he brings this up, but he like kind of says that he chose that he wanted to like take on this punk persona, and it's the same thing when he picks like up the reading manual, and I can't remember what it's called. But I think he brings this up at one point. He's like, I chose these things to be or to like subscribe to or whatever, but he eventually like ended up actually feeling that way and actually subscribing to it. So that's just such an interesting concept, like to choose something and then end up being that way kind of anyways. Yeah.
When he was like explaining to Lou, like when Lou asked like what the book was like, he was like, oh, it's about like trying to be something, and then it turns out you actually were the whole time, and just like what you talk about. But like that was like the whole chapter, and it's
Chapter and
That
that
was
whole,
so
like,
Yeah.
conversation that was like such that just really stuck with me. I was thinking about myself.
I have a question for you guys, because like I definitely like that's like a big part of the book is kind of like, you know, realizing that you can kind of like have this, you know, very multifaceted personality and like kind of like, I mean, you talked about it in season, not going yourself down. And you know, that's really great that you realized all that in high school, but I gotta be honest, I'm like really still working on this. But like, do you guys like kind of relate to that? And if so, like, what do you feel like, I don't know, like helps you feel more like comfortable in your like, you know, like kind of like diverse personality?
I did not know who I was at all in high school, and I was just like, I don't know. Like that was like the one thing I thought like that was like I related to his like growing up experience, but I didn't because I didn't have that like he picked like punk like to throw himself into because he didn't know who he was and he wanted to be like for him to like be safe and like have this group of friends and figure himself out versus like my high school experience was like in a friend group that I that didn't even like me like and that like which is and I didn't have like a sort of like persona like that I feel like until college then like I feel like my college experience relates a lot more to his like, oh, I just wanted to be like different and like feel like I'm cool. So he like goes into punk and then ends up just being punk. Like I feel like that's how I felt like coming into myself in college, whereas like now I actually feel like I know who I am, even though freshman year like I felt like I was just like lying. Like per se, I'm just like, well, I want to be this person. And now I am.
There's a I thought that you mentioned it in the beginning, but like towards the end, around like the graduation. Towards the graduation part, I listened to the audiobook, so I wasn't keeping track of like why I wasn't the book like well enough. Yeah. But I think he was like quoting someone else, and it was like you don't become who you are, you just are it. Like it was something like that.
Yes. No,
by like that whatever
I,
the
like,
yes.
Read it.
Like
Do it again.
the 15.
I was in my kitchen. I was like,
I feel like that's something that I try to keep in mind. Okay, I just heard it like Friday, but ever since he said that, I was like, okay, that's something that I want to keep. Sorry that I exaggerated. I was like, okay, that's something to keep in mind because I feel like I'm all over the place as well.
yes.
And it's just like, okay, I can be like multiple things at once. Like
no, I think that's something that like I like struggle with a lot. Like I mean, I'm an overthinker. A lot.
Too.
So I'm just like how did like these two things mesh and like especially like I don't have like a lot of close friends within my major just because a lot of the people kind of like studying the same thing as me just they're not the same person as I am at all in any way. And it's like it's kind of hard to like feel like you fit into that scenario, but then kind of also like relate it to like other aspects of your life. So it's just kind of like one example, but like I really felt that like listening to work that
I
out. in high
asked you.
school.
Yeah, I'm political science. I literally think I found one person just the beginning of this year, like my senior year, that finally like she's the only person in my major out of every class I've ever taken that like we actually relate and I could see things.
No, like I have
So
a lot
it's
of
definitely very
people, like basically everyone in air transportation pretty much is a guy. And yeah, it's like almost all guys, but then they're also like we just don't have any similar interests, and they're not like mean people, and like I definitely like I have friends in class, whatever. They're nice enough, but it's like I will like talk about anything remotely relating to my personal life, and they'll just kind of stare at me, and I'm just like,
don't. All I was gonna say is like my advice is like don't feel like you have to like just because that's your major that you like your friends have to be within that circle. Like not a single one of my best friends I ended up like meeting throughout college have anything to do with like what I'm actually in school. Like I feel like the best way to find friends is in like literally a place like this, first of all. But just it's like on your campus or literally in passing in a coffee shop. Literally here, like in Kerouac. But yeah, because I never really meshed at all with anyone in my major.
Oh, go ahead.
I'm gonna jump off. I just wanted to say thank you so much
Bye.
for letting me join. Appreciate you all. Thank you.
Friend, thank you so much for saying that. Thank you everybody for coming and listening. He's not here, but thank you. Yeah, this it's 1 year anniversary, so obviously we've been feeling like very reflective as well. Like all the books that we've read, like as I was thinking about this one and like trying to come up with like questions, I just kept thinking about every other book and how they connect, like especially like last month's. But yeah, follow us on Instagram. Reminder, if you want to donate, you can get a sticker. And thank you so much for taking the time to learn about a different perspective today. We're all leaving this room better people, hopefully. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. He's the coolest person ever.
Yeah,
I just like it's so.
Your SpongeBob was so
Thank you. Bye, Ocean. Thank you so much. That was so cool. Yeah, thank you for coming. Of course.
Thank you.
That was
I
my
was
bad.
Patties. I was